The other tool that I think is really helpful and useful that's out there right now is the United States Census has been doing these pulse surveys. So they have one, a small business pulse and then a household pulse. And the cool thing about the small business pulse is that you can look at which industries are reporting the highest revenue losses and then who thinks it's gonna, like their anticipated time to recovery. So I think what's really, unemployment rates kind of show us what's happening with people, but the small business survey helps us understand where businesses are feeling. So who's feeling more confident about reopening and getting back to kind of where they were pre-COVID versus who's maybe feeling a little bit more trepidation about it, who's feeling a little more cautious. So I think that's a nice tool to look at. And then there's a household one as well that looks at, where are people feeling about their income losses and their insecurities, that can also help, I think, small businesses sort of figure out where is the consumer in all of this. And so then that leads into my next recommendation for an indicator, which is consumer spending, and looking at, consumers drive 70% of our economy. So certainly if you're a Main Street business right now, you're feeling that if you're shut down or foot traffic is even down in your communities. We saw a 13% drop in consumer spending in April of 2020. So it's a very real thing. And how the consumer behaves and how they come back, if they feel insecure, even if they still have their jobs, they may be feeling insecure and kind of holding on to their money right now and waiting for, to feel more confident about what's going to happen. And so that consumer spending and sort of understanding, you can find information out there about how much is dropping for services versus goods. What are the major categories where consumer spending is dropping? So again, even if you feel that right now, we might feel it on our Main Street businesses, but if consumers hold back, then obviously eventually demand for manufacturing, construction, they start to drop as well.
I would say just going right out your front door when you're opening up will give you a lot of information about what's going on in your community. Even just spending time counting how many people are walking down your street if you're in retail. What does the foot traffic look like? It's something that can give you a barometer toward what's happening. And I know that so many businesses are disconnected from their consumers right now. So it's especially important to be talking to your consumers to try to tease out what their spending preferences are today versus what they were a few months ago, but also just where their confidence is. Like, are you more cautious today about buying something if you're considering adding a new product line or bringing something new in? Will people be willing to make that jump for it?
I think one of the things, again, kind of talking about short term versus longer term. So economists like this term, the welfare effect, right? So the more wealthy we feel as individual consumers, the more likely we are to spend, and the converse is true. So when you see these really high unemployment numbers, I mean, if you look at the consumer spending data, it's really interesting because with the stimulus packages coming from the federal government, along with people who have kept their jobs feeling a little more uncertain, our savings rate actually went up. Consumer spending went down, the savings rate went up. And I think that's showing that wealth effect where people are kind of holding on to their wallets right now because it's so uncertain. And so the first level of impacts obviously are going to, again, see that is that consumer direct to consumer. So your kind of Main Street businesses are the first ones to really feel that impact as we sort of pull ourselves back a little bit. But I think the longer term impacts then really start to make themselves felt when the consumer isn't spending, there isn't that demand back on the supply chain. So we have some models at the U of M that we can use to measure this, but we can look at, if we are producing, if we don't have restaurants aren't demanding something, then obviously we see those ripple effects back to their suppliers. So they're getting a signal to kind of slow down their production. And so we start to see that, or we see, like I said, consumers not, maybe holding off on buying a new, ATV or something that they had been thinking about for the summer, a new boat, those kinds of things. Then we'll start to see the decline in demand for those, which leads to a second round of effects, in terms of what's happening at the manufacturing and the construction level. So I think we have yet to sort of see how those will play out, and it just depends a little bit again on how this unemployment situation also plays out and how long we sort of are in this mode of decreased economic activity.
I think the broad thing to understand is that layoffs, they don't ripple equally throughout the economy. So we have a lot of layoffs right now that are in the retail and service sectors, and the spending profile of people employed in those sectors might be very different from people that are, at a higher income or different skill level type job. So during the last recession, I can remember there was a really big increase in sales and purchasing, and even the building of stores like dollar stores or similar stores like that, where price really became important when people had cut their spending, and price was less important than the quality or some other factor that was going on in a purchasing decision.
So at the University of Minnesota, we work a lot on economic impact. So we work with communities to really help them understand, how does a change affect, we can look at how a change in one part of the economy affects other parts of the economy. So it's a little hard at this point to just sort of measure what is the economic impact of COVID-19, but we can absolutely look at what is the economic impact of, say, restaurant closures or salon closures. We can look at both sort of the impact of decreased spending by employees, but also Implant has a pretty detailed table that kind of looks at where do businesses spend money, what are their suppliers. So we don't have data, on which businesses they purchase from, but we do know, in order to operate a restaurant, you need to purchase X amount of utilities and Y amount of food service and those kinds of things. So we do have opportunity to kind of dive in with the community to help them understand, what does this really mean? Where are we strong maybe in our supply chain? Like you might look at that and say, we have a lot of local opportunities. Businesses are buying local. Or we might look at that and say, hey, we don't have this thing that most of our businesses want, and they're having to go import that from somewhere else. Maybe that's a development opportunity. There's a couple of things that I'm sort of looking at, and I'm basing this sort of on my own knowledge, but also, I've been out in communities since 2008, so just coming out of the Great Recession, what were some of the things, like if you look back at the data and different communities that I've been in, what are some of the things that I saw that I think contributed to some of the differences? Number one, absolutely, is your economic composition. So we just know reality is that certain industries are more likely to be affected by this, right? I mean, we know tourism, again, I mentioned a couple times, is going to be struggling a little bit, obviously, because people aren't moving around in the same patterns that they did before. We obviously know restaurants and retail, especially on small businesses, are really feeling this right now. And so there's just that reality that if you're, a really tourism-based economy, you may struggle a little bit more immediately coming out of this than a region that maybe is manufacturing something that hasn't felt such an impact from the COVID-19. So, and others, may grow faster coming out of this, right? So we may see kind of a change in, I know looking at that Business Pulse survey that I mentioned earlier, construction companies are feeling pretty optimistic that they don't think that this is going to really affect them much longer than 6 months. Now, whether they're right or wrong, I don't know, but they may very well bounce back a little faster than some other industries will. So just kind of, I think number one, if you're thinking about recovery, is just to kind of look at your economy, understand what are our drivers, what has been growing, what are our main components, and then looking at how do we think they'll be affected longer term. And that's where you can go back to places like the Business Pulse or think about consumer spending and how those things will drive that. I think too that there's still something around workforce, and I know that seems sort of counterintuitive when we're talking about all these really high unemployment numbers. Like, Bridget, why are you worried about workforce? But I think looking at the Great Recession, some of the areas that grew the fastest were areas that were already really growing, as you know, they were already on track, and the Great Recession hit, and they lost jobs. Everybody did. But if you look at which regions recovered faster, it was regions that sort of already had this synergy and this growth and had the available workforce to drive that growth from those businesses. So I still think there's really an emphasis around skills connection, making sure that the workers that are in your region are trained for the jobs that are in your region, and continuing to kind of work in that area. I think it's always I think the skills connection part always comes out in any time when our economy slows down. But I really think that for recovery, really understanding your workforce and making sure you have the right skilled workers or get the skills to the workers is really important.
Talk with business owners in different places and learn about what's going on and how things are going, learn about how consumers are in those places. And one thing is for sure, in that there are differences. Not everything's the same. The kind of culture of the community and the motivation to do things and to work together, it really is different from community to community, from like Main Street Business Group to Main Street Business Group. And we're always trying to find what is that magic that really gets a group of people motivated to work together on their downtown or on these broader economic issues. And I would say that leadership from businesses is a really critical factor. And knowing that many of the people listening to this will be business leaders, some of the things that I'm seeing right now are being led by the business community. Micro grant programs where big businesses that haven't had impacts or have been deemed essential are saying, we can contribute money to a small grant program that will go to the businesses that were most impacted in our community. And we challenge our fellow business leaders to do things like that. That kind of motivation, that kind of leadership is very difficult to pin down and to describe. It's one of those things that you know it when you see it and experience it, and you also know that it really makes a difference. And so, that will, I think, be a factor that will influence regional recovery. It's how much of that culture and motivation by business leaders to help other business leaders will be mustered throughout this. Bridget also mentioned the decision making, and we're seeing there are some communities that are really using this time to build connections across different parts of their community and broaden their decision making, become more effective and efficient and equitable in the way they're making decisions and assessing the context in their community. And that's probably a product of having done some of that work before this.
I've kind of been encouraging communities to do is not to forget about your plan. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed and feel like I got to do everything in these 5 minutes. But those plans, whether it was a comprehensive plan or a strategic plan, they point to the priorities and sort of the vision for your community. And so sort of throwing them out and not considering them right now, I think is a little foolhardy in many ways. To go back to those plans and look at them and say, hey, this is what we had as a vision for a community. This is where we were trying to go. Let's not lose that focus and that vision. I think it's really important to go back to your plan, look at it. What are we trying to accomplish for our community? Because I don't think intrinsically our community values and our community direction has changed. We just have new pressures on it. So how do we balance those pressures against the priorities that we've already set for ourselves? Largely, Greater Minnesota's economy looks very similar to the Twin Cities. We often want to highlight all of our differences. But if you look at the data, which we've established I love to do, we actually look, out here in Greater Minnesota very similar to the metro area. So I think it's important to remember that we aren't that different, and we do all sort of rise and fall together. What happens in Greater Minnesota absolutely affects the Twin Cities and vice versa. So I want to start by saying that. I think where maybe some of our key differences are, obviously agriculture plays a little bit more of a role in greater Minnesota's economy. And we know agriculture right now has a plethora, sort of, it seems like, of issues. Corn prices and commodity prices have been low for a number of years for our farmers, so already kind of struggling with that piece of it. But then, of course, with what happened at some of our packaging plants, we've seen some disruptions to the supply chain, and that's having some effects back onto our, our hog farmers, for example, really were affected by that, but some of our other industries as well. So greater Minnesota, I think a lot of people could argue that agriculture really helped float greater Minnesota during the recession. And with this, we might be in a little bit different of a position in terms of the role agriculture will play in any kind of recovery.
It's really important to understand that in greater Minnesota, retail and the retail landscape it's very different from a large metro area. Part of that difference is that in many small communities, there's not the turnover, the firm exits, the number of businesses that close, and then the number of businesses that open. So those two together is kind of our churn rate, is really different. And in our smaller communities, there's less business closures and also less openings each year. And that this situation might mean that there's more closures that haven't happened in a long time. And that's a terrible thing, but it also might be a place where new business owners are looking to see opportunity. And the businesses closing doesn't necessarily mean that the demand has disappeared for products and services in your area. It just might mean that the financial situation of the businesses that were existing to meet that demand has changed, and they're no longer able to make that work. I remember the last recession, okay, and we were involved in economic development at that time, and it's not everyone will be going bankrupt. That's the thing, but people that are doing well might be shy to talk about it with their fellow business owners, and people that are really having a tough time might be reluctant to share that. And I think the encouragement is for business owners to really be willing to share how things are going with their fellow business owners, and have really conversations, find those people in the community that you can trust and support each other. It is really learning from your fellow business owners that you'll gain the new skills, that you'll find the new market, find the new products, and really, probably most importantly, gain the confidence to make a big change in the way you do business, to adapt. And that really comes from working with lots of businesses on getting them online and trying to get online for the first time. How do I use this? We're seeing so many businesses that they figure all of this stuff out right away, and having your neighbor be a step ahead of you and going back and forth is really the best thing. So build those connections with your fellow business owners and help each other and support each other. On the marketing side, so many communities still have them. They're called social media breakfasts, or they're small lunch and learn events. And hopefully we can all get to those in person someday soon. But attend those things. Look for those. People have been getting together and have been trying to learn how to do these things. So if you haven't participated, now's the time. And build your confidence with people that are in the same situation as you.